My boyfriend was crying when he came home. And when he could finally speak, he told me that he had betrayed me. I thought my world had fallen apart. But then I found out the truth. And what really happened was much worse. I met Zach during my second year of college in a general education class that I'd signed up for mostly to fulfill a requirement. He showed up late on the first day, loud and grinning like he had just come from a party, and honestly he probably had. He had this energy about him, this completely carefree vibe that made it immediately obvious he wasn't there for the academics. Meanwhile, I was already in my seat with my laptop open, highlighting notes from the syllabus like the world's most overprepared student. I remember rolling my eyes as he tripped over someone's backpack and slid into the desk beside me, giving me a wink like we were already friends. I didn't even respond. I had no intention of babysitting some frat bro who smelled like stale beer and cheap cologne. For the first couple of weeks, Zach kept showing up late, barely participating and looking more confused with each passing lecture. And somehow he kept ending up next to me. I don't know if he was assigned to that seat or if he just kept choosing it because I looked like someone who actually knew what was going on. After our first quiz, which he obviously failed, he turned to me with a sheepish grin and said, "Hey, you seem smart. Think you could help me out?" I laughed in his face. Not a polite laugh either, more of a surprised, "You've got to be kidding me" kind of laugh. I told him I had my own studies to worry about and that he should go to office hours like everyone else. But Zach didn't give up. Every class he'd lean over and make a comment or ask what something meant, or slide me a dumb joke written on a scrap of paper. It was annoying but also weirdly consistent. He wasn't trying to be gross or flirt in a creepy way. He just genuinely seemed like he needed help and didn't know how to ask properly. One day, after a pop quiz he bombed hard, he sat on the stairs outside the lecture hall with his head in his hands. I was walking past him, fully intending to keep going when he looked up and said, "I'm seriously gonna fail this class, and if I do, I'm probably getting kicked out. Please. Just once a week. I'll even pay you. Pizza, cash, whatever." There was something in the way he said it. Like, not desperation in a performative way, but actual, honest panic. And I don't know why, but I sighed, turned around and said, "Fine. But no pizza. Just show up on time, shut up, and actually try." He smiled like I'd just handed him a winning lottery ticket and said, "Deal." That was how I became Zach's tutor. The first few tutoring sessions with Zach were nothing short of a disaster. He showed up late every single time, sometimes by 10 minutes, sometimes by 20, always with some flimsy excuse about traffic or oversleeping, even though we both lived on campus. He never brought the right materials. One time he arrived without a notebook, another time he didn't even have a pen, and almost always, he had this glazed-over look like he hadn't even glanced at the reading assignment. It drove me absolutely insane. I had structured our sessions with the kind of meticulous planning I used for my own study time, hoping to cover certain chapters each week and prep for the midterm well in advance. But trying to get Zach to focus was like trying to train a squirrel on espresso. He'd constantly glance at his phone, scroll through messages, sometimes even laugh out loud at a meme mid-sentence while I was explaining a concept. I wanted to quit so badly more than once. After one especially frustrating hour where he couldn't even remember the professor's name, I packed up my notes and told him this wasn't going to work. But then, as I stood up to leave, Zach reached for his backpack, hesitated, and looked at me with this expression I hadn't seen before, stripped of his usual cocky smile, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. "Please don't give up," he said, and his tone wasn't begging, but it wasn't far from it either. "I know I've been acting like an idiot. I know I don't deserve your help, but I'm trying. I swear I really am." And there was something in his eyes right then, something honest and tired and kind of vulnerable, like a crack in the mask he always wore. I couldn't explain it, not logically anyway, but in that moment something shifted. The part of me that wanted to walk away softened just enough to keep me standing there. I slowly sat back down, opened my notebook again and said, "All right. But next time be on time. And bring a damn pen." He smiled like I just handed him the keys to the kingdom, and for the first time I thought, maybe, just maybe, this wasn't going to be a total waste of time. After that turning point, Zach genuinely started to change, and it was like watching a completely different person slowly emerge from the mess he used to hide behind. He started showing up to our sessions on time, sometimes even early, waiting for me at the library table with a coffee in hand that he sheepishly admitted he wasn't sure how I liked, so he just guessed and hoped for the best. It was sweet in a clumsy, unexpected way, and even though the first few coffees were way too sugary, I drank them anyway because it was the effort that mattered. Instead of zoning out and scrolling through his phone, he began asking real questions, interrupting me in the middle of an explanation not because he was bored but because he genuinely wanted to understand. He would underline passages in his textbook, scribble down messy notes, and frown in concentration in a way that was actually kind of endearing. Every once in a while, he'd even send me a text outside of our sessions, asking if I thought he should start an outline for an essay early or if he could run a thesis idea by me. Little by little, the image I had of him as just some party boy started to peel away, and underneath it I found someone I hadn't expected. A guy who was smart, curious, and surprisingly sensitive. He still had his rough edges, still cracked dumb jokes when he got nervous and occasionally forgot important dates, but there was a sincerity about him now that made all the difference. He wanted to do better, not just to pass the class, but because he had started to believe he could, and every time he looked at me with that determined spark in his eyes, I felt a strange flutter in my chest that had nothing to do with academics. Our relationship developed slowly, like a song you don't realize you've been humming until it's already stuck in your head. Zach had this persistent charm about him, always towing the line between playful and sincere, and after our tutoring sessions started going better, he began slipping in little comments. Nothing overt at first, just lighthearted suggestions like grabbing lunch sometime or checking out a campus movie night. I always turned him down, gently but firmly, convinced it would be a mistake to blur the lines between helping him pass a class and whatever this thing between us was slowly becoming. But he never got angry or pushy about it. He'd just laugh it off and say, "Worth a shot," like he already knew he'd try again later. Eventually, out of a mix of curiosity and maybe a tiny ache in my chest I didn't want to admit was longing, I agreed to one date. Just one. He booked a table at this slightly too fancy restaurant downtown, trying to impress me I think, but the second we sat down the entire evening started unraveling. The menu was confusing, the waiter was snooty, the music too loud, and both of us were nervous in that painfully obvious way where every sentence sounds like a weird job interview answer. I was starting to regret the whole thing when Zach looked across the table, made a face like he was surrendering to the awkwardness, and said with a crooked smile, "This is terrible, right?" I burst out laughing, loud and real, and it cracked whatever tension had wrapped itself around us. We left the restaurant within minutes, ditched the whole fancy date idea, and ended up at a greasy drive-thru 10 minutes later. Sitting in his beat-up car with the windows cracked open and burger wrappers spread across our laps, we finally relaxed. We talked for hours, about childhood memories, weird dreams, the most ridiculous things we'd ever believed as kids, and it felt effortless in a way I hadn't expected. Somewhere between a mouthful of fries and his story about getting banned from a bowling alley in high school, I looked over at him, really looked at him, and felt something shift. That was the night I realized I was falling in love with him, right there in the dim glow of the dashboard lights, ketchup on his hoodie, and that big boyish grin aimed right at me. We dated for months before I ever let him kiss me, not because I didn't want to, but because something about Zach, something tender and careful, made me want to take my time and savor every step. From the outside, people probably assumed we moved fast, that we must have fallen into something physical early on, especially considering how different we seemed. Me, the quiet bookish type, and him, the guy everyone used to know as the life of every party. But in truth, nothing about us was rushed. We'd go on long walks across campus late at night, our hands brushing but never quite touching, or sit on the floor of his apartment listening to music and eating gas station snacks like it was a five-star meal. There was always a current between us, but he never pushed, never made me feel like there was any timeline I had to meet except my own. When I finally leaned in and kissed him for the first time, it was after a movie night at my place, my head on his shoulder, his fingers gently tracing the edge of my sleeve. I looked up, caught him watching me like I was made of glass, and I realized I trusted him in a way I hadn't trusted anyone before. The kiss was soft, slow, and somehow even better than I'd imagined, and afterward he whispered, "Worth the wait," with a smile that stayed in my memory for weeks. Almost a full year passed before we had sex, and by then, there wasn't a single doubt in my mind. I knew I was giving myself to someone who genuinely loved me, who respected my boundaries and made me feel like I was worth every second of patience. There had never been pressure, no subtle hints or frustrated sighs, only gentle affection and a kind of devotion that made me feel safe. The night it happened, it wasn't about some grand romantic gesture or perfect timing, it was about the way he held me like I was something sacred, how he kissed me with his whole heart, and how afterward, he didn't say anything at all, just pulled me close and rested his forehead against mine like he'd finally come home. Zach gradually gave up the party scene not because I ever asked him to, but simply because he wanted to, and when I once asked him why, he just smiled and said, "You are more interesting than any party." It wasn't some grand dramatic change overnight. It happened quietly, naturally, the way seasons shift without you realizing until suddenly the air smells different and the days feel softer. The wild nights and loud bars that used to be such a central part of his life just seemed to lose their appeal, replaced instead by something quieter, something that felt more like home. We started building a new circle of friends together, people who weren't interested in hangovers or screaming over music in crowded rooms but preferred quiet laughter, shared meals, and staying up too late playing board games around a coffee table. They were thoughtful, grounded, and kind, the kind of people who brought their own mugs for tea and stayed after a movie to talk about it. Our weekends slowly became filled with cozy routines. Game nights where someone always brought homemade cookies, spontaneous movie marathons under a mountain of throw blankets, and conversations that stretched into the early hours of the morning. Zach, who once thrived on noise and chaos, seemed genuinely happier in these calm shared spaces, sitting beside me, his hand resting lightly on my knee, looking more alive than he ever had in the middle of any party. Watching him grow into this version of himself, not for me but because he wanted it too, made me fall even deeper in love with him. The only thing Zach couldn't seem to let go of was his childhood friend, Trevor, a permanent fixture from his past who clung to their connection with the desperation of someone terrified of change. From the moment I met Trevor, I knew he didn't like me, not in the subtle, passive-aggressive way that can be smoothed over with time, but in the overt, eye-rolling, dismissive way that made it painfully clear I wasn't welcome in his world. He was that guy who peaked in high school and never quite moved on, the one who still referred to women as chicks, and cracked sexist jokes like it was some badge of honor, expecting everyone around him to laugh along. His presence felt like a relic of a version of Zach I'd never known, a version I wasn't sure still existed, but that Trevor seemed determined to drag back into the light. Whenever we were all in the same room, the air turned sour. Trevor would talk over me, mock any conversation that wasn't about beer, girls, or sports, and make jabs about how Zach was getting domesticated, or whipped, now that he had a girlfriend who read books for fun. I never gave him the satisfaction of reacting, but it ate at me. I couldn't understand why Zach, who had evolved so much, who had shown me such depth and kindness, still held on to someone so toxic. I asked him about it once, carefully, not as an ultimatum but out of genuine confusion, and he just said, "Trevor's been there since I was 10. He's not always like that." I didn't push further, but the truth was Trevor was always like that, at least with me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that his presence was a thread unraveling something we were trying to build. After one particularly tense evening where Trevor spent the entire night making snide comments about my book club friends, and joking that Zach had been neutered by love, I finally sat down with Zach and told him as gently but firmly as I could, that I didn't want to be in the same room as Trevor anymore. I wasn't trying to force a wedge between them, but being around him made me feel small, unwelcome, and constantly on edge, and I needed to draw a line for my own peace of mind. To Zach's credit, he didn't argue or try to defend Trevor. He just nodded slowly, looked me in the eye and said, "Okay, I get it." From that day forward, he made sure to keep their hangouts separate. If he wanted to see Trevor, they'd meet up alone, usually at Trevor's place or at some dive bar where they could play video games and drink a couple of beers, just the two of them. Zach always kept me in the loop, not because I asked him to but because he wanted me to feel safe and respected. He'd send a quick text when he was heading over and another when he was on his way back. Sometimes even a picture of the sad bar food they were eating or a dumb joke Trevor had made, as if to remind me that he wasn't hiding anything. I never questioned where he was or who he was with, not because I trusted Trevor but because I trusted Zach. He made sure I never felt forgotten, even in the spaces where I didn't belong. One night, Trevor invited Zach to a private party he was throwing to celebrate his engagement to a girl named Anna, someone I'd never met but had heard mentioned in passing during one of Zach's recaps of their hangouts. I wasn't planning on going. I had a major deadline at work and a pile of documents I couldn't afford to ignore, but Zach really wanted to be there for Trevor and I didn't see a reason to stop him. Before he left, he kissed me on the forehead and promised not to drink too much, said he'd be back before it got too late, and even joked that if the party was lame, he might sneak out early to bring me a milkshake or something. The night passed quietly at first, just me and my laptop and the comforting rhythm of keys clacking as I worked through my to-do list. A couple of hours went by and I didn't think much of it, assuming he was mingling, maybe catching up with old acquaintances or watching Trevor act like the king of the night. But sometime past midnight, my phone buzzed with a message from Zach, short and typed with clumsy fingers. "Too drunk. Can't drive. Staying at Trevor's." It caught me off guard, not just because he said he wouldn't drink much, but because it didn't sound like him. Zach wasn't the kind of guy who let himself lose control like that anymore, especially not when he'd promised otherwise. I stared at the message for a long time, something uneasy beginning to twist in my chest, not panic exactly but a tight, quiet doubt that I couldn't quite shake. The next morning, just after sunrise, Zach came home and the moment I saw his face I knew something was deeply wrong. His eyes were bloodshot, not just from a hangover but from crying. Really crying, the kind of raw, exhausted crying that leaves your face swollen and your voice hoarse. He stood in the doorway like he didn't know if he was allowed to come in, like the very act of being there was a question he wasn't sure he had the right to ask. I rushed toward him, panic already blooming in my chest, but when I reached out to touch his arm, he flinched, not away from me exactly but inward, like he was ashamed of his own skin. He couldn't look at me, and when he finally spoke, his voice cracked so hard it barely sounded like him. "I did something awful," he said, and I felt my stomach drop. I asked him what happened, trying to stay calm, trying not to let my mind race to every terrible place it was already sprinting toward. He sat down on the edge of the couch, put his head in his hands, and after a long silence he whispered, "I cheated on you. With Anna." The words hit me like a blow to the chest, so sudden and sharp I couldn't even speak at first. My heart didn't just break, it crumpled. Everything I thought I knew about him, about us, about the trust we'd spent years building, felt like it shattered in an instant. I stood there in silence, staring at him, barely able to breathe as he broke down in front of me, sobbing like he hated himself, like saying the words out loud made it even more real. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to feel beyond the crushing weight of betrayal that pressed down on every part of me. But then, as I sat there frozen and he sat crumbling in front of me, he took a shaking breath and told me the rest, the real story, the one that made my blood run cold. He said he hadn't just cheated on me, not in the way people think of cheating, not in the way that involves choice or desire or some premeditated betrayal. He told me he had been drunk to the point of unconsciousness, that he barely remembered anything after his third drink, and that everything else was a blur, a mess of flickering lights and sounds that didn't make sense. He said he remembered feeling dizzy, then darkness, and then, somewhere deep in the early hours, he came to, not fully awake, not even sure where he was, only to find Anna on top of him, performing oral sex, and Trevor sitting in the corner with his phone pointed directly at them. Zach's voice cracked again when he said it, like he couldn't even believe the words coming out of his mouth. He told me he was too drunk to react, too disoriented to move or speak or stop it, and the next thing he knew, he was alone in a different room, naked, sick to his stomach and terrified, with no idea how he had gotten there or what else had happened. He said he had stayed up all night trying to piece it together, sobbing in Trevor's bathroom, trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense, something that had stripped him of control and left him feeling hollow and violated. And as I sat there listening to him, my heart still breaking, it wasn't just heartbreak anymore, it was horror, a deep, creeping sickness that settled in my bones as I realized this wasn't a story about betrayal the way I had first thought. It was something far darker, far more twisted. And suddenly everything I believed about Trevor, about trust, about safety, cracked open into something I didn't know how to hold. At first, no matter how gently he tried to explain, no matter how broken he looked while doing it, I couldn't see it as anything but a betrayal. All I could feel was the devastation of hearing that the person I trusted most had been with someone else, and even though he said he hadn't chosen it, even though his voice trembled with shame instead of guilt, my mind kept circling back to that one unbearable word, cheated. I didn't have the clarity then to separate what had happened from the pain I was feeling, and in that moment, I couldn't yet understand the weight of what he had truly endured. I went silent for hours, maybe even days, retreating into my thoughts, unable to look him in the eye while the words replayed in my head like a sick echo I couldn't turn off. But as time passed and I gave myself space to think, really think, I started reading articles and discussions from counselors, diving into the stories of others who had been through similar things, and I realized how incredibly wrong I had been. What happened to Zach wasn't infidelity. It wasn't a lapse in judgment or some drunken mistake he could have avoided. He had been drugged or pushed so far into intoxication that his body had stopped listening to him. He hadn't cheated. He had been assaulted. That understanding hit me like a freight train. The moment I let go of my pain long enough to see it for what it was, everything changed. The memory of him sitting there, crying and shaking, not because he had done something wrong but because he believed, truly believed, that losing me was the inevitable consequence of being violated, tore straight through me. The fact that his first thought wasn't about himself or the trauma, but that he had ruined us, that he had somehow failed me, shook me to my core. He hadn't just been hurt, he'd been left completely alone in that pain, carrying it with the belief that I would see him as broken or worse, guilty. And realizing that made me feel something deeper than love. It made me feel responsible, not for what happened, but for helping him carry the truth of it, so he would never have to shoulder that darkness by himself again. For a few days after everything came out, we barely spoke, moving around each other like ghosts trapped in the same apartment, breathing the same air but living in entirely different worlds. There was no anger in the silence, no shouting or accusations, just this heavy, aching stillness, like the weight of what had happened was too big to fit inside our small space without crushing us both. I spent my days pretending to be busy, cleaning things that didn't need cleaning, scrolling through my phone without seeing anything while Zach kept to himself, sleeping too much or not at all, always careful to stay out of my way like he thought he was some kind of walking wound I might flinch away from if he got too close. One night, after another long evening of pretending not to hear each other breathe across the apartment, I came out of my room for a glass of water and saw him sitting on the couch in the dark. He wasn't doing anything, no TV, no phone, just sitting there staring at nothing with an emptiness on his face that made my chest ache. He looked emotionally dead, hollowed out from the inside like something essential had been stolen from him and he didn't know how to get it back. Without thinking, I crossed the room and sat down next to him, close enough that our knees brushed. I didn't say much, just placed my hand gently on his and whispered, "I'm not leaving. I'm right here. I'm staying." The moment the words left my mouth, he crumbled. Tears poured from his eyes in a way that was raw and wordless, like a dam finally breaking after being held back too long. He turned toward me, almost hesitant, but when I opened my arms, he fell into them like he was drowning and I was the only thing keeping him afloat. We held each other tightly, breathing each other in, not trying to fix anything, not trying to make sense of it all, just holding on because sometimes that's the only thing you can do. That night, something began to stitch itself back together between us, not perfectly, not neatly, but piece by fragile piece. It wasn't about pretending the pain hadn't happened. It was about finding a way to exist alongside it, together, and somehow it was enough. It was the beginning of healing, and for the first time in days I believed we could find our way back. We talked about everything, not all at once, but slowly, patiently, over hours that bled into early morning light, both of us curled up on the couch like we were trying to rebuild something sacred from the ashes. Zach apologized again, voice trembling, like he still couldn't quite believe I was there beside him instead of walking away, and I stopped him gently, took his face in my hands, and told him he didn't need to keep apologizing for something that had been done to him, not by him. I told him clearly and calmly that what happened wasn't betrayal, it was violence, and I understood that now. I told him I wasn't angry, not even a little, because I knew he hadn't chosen any of it, and all I wanted was to be there for him, to help him carry the weight he'd been holding alone. He broke down again then, not in the same shattering way as before, but like a breath he'd been holding for days had finally left his body. He pulled out his phone and handed it to me without a word, the screen already unlocked. I watched him open his contacts and show me that both Trevor and Anna were blocked, not just deleted but shut out completely, and then he did something I never asked him to do. He went into his settings and removed the password entirely. "You can look through anything," he said quietly. "There's nothing I want to hide. Not ever again." And I didn't need to scroll through a single thing because that moment, that gesture, said more than any message or call history ever could. He was letting me in completely, offering transparency not out of guilt, but out of trust, and I could feel it in my bones that he meant every word. That conversation didn't fix everything overnight, but it laid the foundation for something stronger, something honest and deeply human. It wasn't about going back to how things were before. It was about learning how to move forward, together, through something neither of us had ever expected, but both of us were willing to face hand in hand. We both agreed without hesitation that there would be no contact with Trevor or Anna ever again. It wasn't even a discussion really, it was just a quiet, mutual understanding that whatever those two had once meant in his life was now severed permanently. The betrayal was too deep, too cruel, and any ties to them had become a source of pain neither of us wanted lingering in our lives. At one point, I suggested going to the police, told him that what they did wasn't just immoral, it was criminal, and that he didn't deserve to carry this in silence while they walked away without consequences. But he shook his head slowly, and I could see the fear etched into his features, not just of confrontation but of everything that might come with it. He explained that their families are incredibly close, almost like extended relatives, intertwined through years of childhood vacations, birthday parties, and holidays spent at each other's dinner tables. The thought of tearing through that web, of being the one to speak up and potentially watch it all collapse, was too overwhelming for him, especially when he wasn't even sure anyone would believe him. "They'll just say I was drunk," he whispered, eyes downcast. "They'll say I wanted it. That I should have fought harder or not gotten that drunk to begin with." And I hated that he was probably right, hated that the world still made victims question themselves more than it questioned the people who hurt them. Still, he promised me he was going to take care of himself, that even if he wasn't ready for the police, he was going to do what he could to protect his health. He scheduled an appointment to get tested, not because he suspected anything specific, but because he was terrified that Anna might have infected him with something. He said it with quiet shame, as though even saying it aloud made him feel contaminated, and I had to stop him, had to hold his hand and remind him over and over that none of this was his fault. Watching him go through that, seeing his strength even in his fear, made me realize just how much I loved him. Not just for who he had been before but for who he was now, surviving something unthinkable and still choosing to move forward. We deleted our social media accounts not out of fear or shame, but because we wanted to clear out the noise and focus entirely on each other, on healing, on being present without the constant buzz of other people's lives in the background. It felt symbolic in a way, like closing the door on everything outside that had once intruded too far into our world. We needed space to breathe, to figure out how to live in the aftermath of something that had nearly broken us, and more than anything we needed each other. Life is hard right now. Some days are heavy, some nights are restless, and there are moments when the silence between us still holds the shape of what happened. But through it all, we found a kind of resilience we didn't know we had. There are still shadows, yes, but there's light too. Quiet mornings with coffee and whispered apologies, laughter that feels a little more sacred now, and the way he looks at me like he's grateful I stayed. And I am. I'm grateful too. Grateful that we didn't let it destroy us, that we chose to fight for something real, something worth saving. We are stronger than we thought, not in the way people talk about strength like it's loud and defiant, but in the quiet, steady way of simply showing up for each other every single day. And despite everything, or maybe because of it, I am absolutely sure of one thing: he loves me. I see it in his eyes, in the way he holds my hand when words won't come, in the way he listens when I need to talk and stays silent when I need space. And I love him too, more deeply than I ever have, with a heart that's cracked and healing but still full.